Thank you for an extraordinary week of wonderful lectures, and I hope we can repay your generosity in some small way by utilising this information. The question: how can we involve every man, woman and child in this country in the enormous task ahead to change our thinking in terms of what we need as opposed to what we want or think we want as a result of the continuous bombardment of commercial brainwashing that leads to the excess and massive waste we see around us? In a future carbon economy, can we follow the British example to encourage the consumer to think in terms of carbon dollars, perhaps, with product labelling that includes a traceable carbon cost and sustainable production practices? And just a small point, when we came to Melbourne last week, we bought 2 litres of milk and 1 carton of eggs. 1 litre of milk and the carton of eggs were from Brisbane. The other litre was from New South Wales. Now, what is the carbon cost there? Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentleman at the back.
Right. This is to you, Tim. Tim, do you think that...
Sorry, your name?
Roger Taylor. Do you think that by concentrating the discussion on climate change almost exclusively and in terms of solutions in terms of greenhouse gases, you're ignoring the other more broadly based concerns of global change, such as resource depletion, degradation of our natural systems, species loss? We ignore the drivers of all of these issues, of which climate change is but one, and the underlying drivers are population growth and our lifestyles, which are no longer sustainable. That unless we focus more generally on these drivers, that we are bound to oversimplify the problem, and that we may, in fact, be kidding ourselves, and that all this discussion will be no more than a charade.
Thank you, Roger. Valerie, you alluded to it a little bit in your comments earlier about the Big Ask campaign and also some of the work that the British government had done in relation to climate change. But I wonder if you'd like to comment a little bit on the role of the consumer, about informing the consumer about the impact that they can have on the problem.
I think it's really important that we help people to make the kinds of decisions they want to make. I think that people will make the decisions about changing their lives over a period of time. I think it's really important that people don't feel that they're being forced to do... we don't all want to make decisions immediately about changing the way we live our lives, and I think it's really important that people are able to make that choice and have the information that enables them to make that choice. And some of that is about giving them information that helps them to make those choices about what they buy, but also about how they can change their lifestyle and things that they can do to make a difference. Too much of the debate is at a level which makes it seem impossible, and so people give up.
Thank you. And then I'd just like to go to Mark, and then Nick, and then Tim, if you could respond to the question from the gentleman at the back. Mark.
Yes, I'm going to try to respond to both questions at once because they raise the same issue about the rate of change. We know the rate of change to be increasing in our society, but we are not about to have a complete revolution in the industrial base of our society overnight. We've built up the industrial base of this society over 100 or 200 years, depending on how you want to look at economic processes. And what's striking to me is that the kind of comments that are being made in this room, the kind of comments that both questions rested on, the ideas that both comments rest on, which is thinking about how we live, thinking about carbon footprint, thinking about why the milk came from Brisbane and the eggs came from an equally long distance away. All of those are very new thoughts. They are ideas that happily have increasing currency in our society, and I think certainly what governments can do is to encourage information, encourage more explanation about the science. Certainly I've been working on getting climate scientists to go to Parliament House so that parliamentarians are better informed about all of these matters. I'm quite encouraged about the possibility of change in the way people live and in the way people think about things like carbon footprints and carbon consequences.
Thank you, Mark. Nick.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Look, just firstly in relation to the labelling, I mean, yes, informed consumers are powerful consumers, and I'd absolutely support some of the suggestions being made. But I did want to respond to the question that was asked over there, because I absolutely accept the premise of the question. I mean, climate change is just one of a series of global policy challenges facing us. You spoke about population, and there's a key and obvious link with climate change there. And biodiversity loss is another one that's right at the top of my mind, and obviously a link between climate change, population and biodiversity loss. And it's a really interesting public policy question, really. Do you pursue a somewhat narrow public policy focus of just climate change and then roll out what you learn and how you respond to climate change, including a cost on carbon? Do you then roll out those public policy parameters to deal with other issues, or do you try to deal with all of the issues at once? And I have to confess my thinking's changed a little bit on this. I've previously been an advocate of, look, we've got to address all of these things in one big public policy shift. But having seen how poorly we're responding to climate change at a global level, my optimism that we could actually do that within a timely way is a lot less than it used to be. So I now have a personal view that we should be trying everything we can to deliver good public policy solutions on climate change, because that is the pressing issue, although, as I said, not the only one, and then roll out the public policy solutions we've developed around climate change, including putting a strong cost on carbon to deal with some of those other issues. But it's a very vexed question, and I'm not certain that I have the right or all the answers there.
Tim.
Look, I do need to defend my curatorial decision, I guess, to label the series Innovating in the Face of Climate Change. And just to say that if you'd been here through the week, you would have heard Tim Jackson give a lecture which is arguably our most popular lecture for the series, where he argued for the decoupling of prosperity and growth, which is very much going towards the issues that you're talking about. I was very keen to have our Indian colleagues speak, because for them, addressing climate change and dealing with this affluence and prosperity issue and the aspirations of people are absolutely front and centre. We heard Kartikeya Sarapai say last night that in India, over the next 14 months, they will add the population of Australia to their country. It's simply not an option for them to aspire to a level of affluence that we have in this country. But having said that, it is absolutely essential that we deal with this very urgent problem of emissions reduction in this country. We heard Grant King explain on the second night of this series that if we wait till 2013 to implement a carbon price in this country, we will have lost the opportunity to make that 5% emission reduction. And that's because the investments that are required in new infrastructure have very long lead times. By 2013, the decisions are going to be made. So it is very valid in my mind to keep our focus on that urgent issue, that urgent problem, at the same time that we start scoping out these bigger questions, which you quite rightly pointed to.
Thank you, Tim. We've got 10 more minutes of questions before we go over to Tim to sum up, and then to Chrissy from the Wheeler Centre. I'd like to take a question from the woman down here first, and then the gentleman by the microphone at the back. And I'd also like to thank the woman down here who was in front to let the woman who was behind stand up, because you've already asked 2 questions. So, your name?
Karen Alexander, and I'm from the Victoria Naturally Alliance. Victoria Naturally Alliance is 9 environment groups here in who got together to look at the biodiversity crisis in Victoria. It seems to be the era of crises. There's a global change, obviously, climate change crisis, but also the biodiversity crisis, which is much harder, I think, for people to understand. And Tim may have talked about this in previous lectures, but I haven't been able to be here, unfortunately.
A question.
The question is, these 2 crises do not seem to be very well linked, and yet it's clear that clearing and planting is a major way of helping to both reduce emissions and also to address the sequestration and putting back of biodiversity. It's a very simple question, and I'd like a yes from each of the party political people. I don't think that any of the parties, and Tim, Nick's got a big issue with forestry in Tasmania, actually managed to bring these two issues together. And I want a yes from each of you that you will actively pursue the ways of bringing those two issues together. And if you need some expert advice, I'm not claiming to have it, Tim would have it, but I can certainly find you that thing so that we can come to you, I can come to you after this meeting or at a later stage to push through your parties the things that will help to address both those crises.
Thank you. I think all you can really ask for is an answer, and I think we should allow them the answer yes, maybe, or no. And I'm quite happy to go from this side of the stage to the other.
I'm very happy to give a yes.
Yes.
Because we're already there. We know.
No, but we only want one word. So
okay.
Yes. Nick?
Yes. Yes, I think everyone is committed to
Valerie, don't
promoting biodiversity.
I can't say anything.
I know, good. Tim?
I'm going to take the curator's privilege to answer properly and just say that unless you're committed to actually addressing this issue, you don't have a viable climate policy. And I take the state of Victoria as an example of that. This state still allows old growth logging of the most carbon-dense forests on the planet. You just can't have a viable policy with that sort of thing in place.
Gentleman at the back, your name.
YP Chan. Tim, thank you very much for this wonderful occasion and on this important subject of climate change. You managed to get yourself, what I want to say is that, you are preaching to the converted. This group, the John Howard so-called lefty loonies, are your converted flock, so to speak. But you managed to, I think you managed to get yourself belted by Andrew Bolt yesterday. I think it's done a lot of damage to your credibility. So I hope there is a rebuttal coming from you someday soon. But
can we have a question?
My question is to Malcolm Turnbull.
Oh.
Tim,
at least it's someone on the stage. I like that.
Tim Flannery, a few days ago, said he didn't want skeptics in this forum. In this panel. He didn't want any skeptics in this panel. All he wanted was solutions, conversation, so we can move forward. Well, Malcolm, in your 5 minutes this evening, you spent nearly 4 minutes.
Can we have a question to Malcolm Turnbull?
Yes, yep. Lambasting Kevin Rudd, and I thought I was in the election rally. My question to you is, when you become the opposition leader after the election, will you, given that Minchin won't be there after the election, will you take on the ETS and support the government in passing it through Parliament?
Well, thank you. Well, that's the ultimately hypothetical question, although it's very flattering. But, well, look, I think everybody knows where I stand on this issue. I'm committed to effective action on climate change. I don't... Look, an emissions trading scheme, can I just say this about an ETS? It is just a piece of economic plumbing. You know, there are a number of ways you can transform an economy over time to a lower emission economy. You can do it with a carbon tax, you can do it with regulation, you could theoretically even do it on the basis of the government picking up the tab completely. It's not very efficient though. The question is, how do you do it cost effectively? And I believe a cap and trade scheme is the most efficient. But you've got to get on and do it. What we need is action. We've got to stop the excuses and we have to act. And right now, we are facing, and I'm sorry if I've spent 4 minutes criticising Kevin Rudd. He's always said such nice things about me. But can I just say this? The fact is, and this is the thing that we've got to remember: we are living in a country which does not have an effective climate change policy at all. We are living in a country whose Prime Minister has said climate's the greatest moral challenge of our time and we're going to cut our emissions by 5%, but there is no policy that the government has capable of achieving that. I have never seen a policy vacuum like this in my life.
OK, thanks, Malcolm. We've heard that. Now,
Jonathan Upson. My question is, do you think the Rudd government's carbon pollution reduction scheme was designed with the objective to be the most efficient and effective carbon reduction scheme, or was it designed to be a very effective wedge into the opposition, which ended up being the result?
Thank you. The lady at the front.
Jane Morton from the Climate Emergency Network. A related question. Given that Garnaut said that a carbon tax is better than a heavily compromised ETS like the CPRS, do you personally support the Garnaut interim carbon tax proposed by the Greens? And in your personal opinion, how do you think it compares with the CPRS? That's for Tim, Malcolm and Mark.
I was going to ask for a one-word answer from Nick McKim, actually. He could just say yes. But let's respect the questioner. If they're both questions related to the CPRS, we might take them both together. The first question was about efficient and effective versus something that had some political purpose behind it, and then the value or otherwise of the proposal that's come forward from the Greens based on Ross Garnaut's position. Mark, you might want to kick off.
Well, I'll go back to what I said in my remarks about the carbon pollution reduction scheme. This is a matter of the way in which the Parliament operates, and in order to get the carbon pollution reduction scheme through the Parliament, we had two choices. We could look for the support of the Greens, who would have had to have brought with them the two other senators, who could have been Liberals and were in fact, at the end of the day, Liberals, or Senators Xenophon and Fielding. Alternatively, we could choose, and we did choose to do this, negotiate with the Liberal and National parties to achieve their support for a scheme. Because I say to all of you, something is better than nothing. And nothing is where we are as a result of the failure of the bipartisan agreement and the failure of the Greens to vote with the two Liberal senators who crossed the floor. And I'm going to answer the interjection, which we've heard often, that we did not negotiate with the Greens. The Greens needed to come and say, we can deliver a majority on the floor of the Senate, which they were never able to do. It is ultimately about parliamentary politics. And as to the suggestion that, as to the question about whether or not a cap-and-trade scheme is better than simply a tax, we favour a cap-and-trade scheme because it actually imposes a cap. It puts a limit on emissions, and that's what we think is essential to a scheme.
Malcolm, do you want to go next?
Well, look, I don't think there's any doubt that Kevin Rudd did use the CPRS as a wedge against the coalition. And having said that, though, to be scrupulously fair, the CPRS was an evolution from the emissions trading scheme that was being designed under the Howard government, and Martin Parkinson, who's head of the Department of Climate Change, you've heard from in this series, was put in that job under the Howard government. So there was, quite a continuum, a continuation of policy development between the Howard and the Rudd government. So, as I said in the House, the CPRS owes as much to John Howard as it does to Kevin Rudd. On the question of carbon tax versus emissions trading scheme, it really boils down to this. The argument in favour of a tax is that it's simpler. There's a dollar amount, $25 a tonne, whatever it is. But while the price is certain, the level of emissions is not. The virtue of a cap and trade is that you set a cap on emissions, so you know your emissions are going to be no more than the permitted amount, but what you don't know is what the price will be. And so generally, the general view around the world, and it's been the experience, and I think some of your speakers have said this, Tim, at this series, is that the emissions trading scheme approach has been preferred. But they both put a price on carbon. They're both market-based solutions. They both have merit. You can make a case for either. I think the ETS is a better approach. but a tax would be better than nothing.
Tim, do you just want to say a brief word, because I know you get the chance at the last word, and then I'll go to Valerie. Tim.
Very, very briefly.
Just look.
I'm sorry, I've forgotten yet.
Well, could I just... Garneau's point was that if there's a failure at Copenhagen, we should produce an interim carbon tax until we can get things sorted out. I don't think there was a failure at Copenhagen. There's been a failure of domestic politics, and I guess I'd say let's have an interim carbon tax until we can get that sorted out, if it looks like it's going to be a long process.
Yep.
But I just wish people were here to hear Denny Ellerman, the MIT economist, speak about the merits of an emissions trading scheme versus a carbon tax. There are numerous aspects of a carbon trading scheme that make it more efficient and more certain that you get your reductions.
Valerie.
I want to say two quick things, if I may. One is about Copenhagen and post-Copenhagen. There's no doubt we had huge ambitions for Copenhagen, all of which were not realised. It would be wrong, however, to think that it was a complete failure. We've got 80 countries that have already signed up to ambitious targets as a result of what was agreed at Copenhagen, and we just need to recognise that, because there's a degree of dynamism that has come out of that process that we don't want to lose sight of over the next few months and years. The second thing is just to go back to something that I said in my remarks, which is, of course, the debate here at the moment is about, tax or an emissions trading scheme, what's the best thing to use. It's really important to remember that in a complex economy like Australia, and this is what we found out in the United Kingdom, you need a mix of solutions. It's not just about one thing or another. So it's good to have the debate about, do you want a tax or do you want an emissions trading scheme? But regulation, innovation, what you do in terms of the kinds of investments you make into renewables all have a role to play.
Thank you very much, Valerie. As I said, there are many, many more questions that we could ask. We could keep this session going on for a long time, but I feel I have to draw things to a close with just a few words to say that it's been an absolute pleasure for me to act as a moderator, working again very closely with Tim, as I have over quite a lengthy period, and it's been a real delight working with the whole team at the Wheeler Centre. With that, I will step aside and ask Tim Flannery to both say the last word and to thank our panel. Tim.
In the Republic, Plato sets forth an evolution of political structures for humanity. And the final three in that evolution are what he calls a timocracy, which is a sort of an oligarchy of power. And then he goes on to what he calls his imperfect forms of government, included among which a democracy. And he then says, but of course all of these imperfect forms of government ultimately lead to tyranny. If we could reverse Plato's structure and evolution and establish the timocracy as coming out of democracy, and I were the Tim, we may have a very different set of outcomes, because I could simply dictate the sort of solutions I'd like. Unfortunately, that's not the position we're in. We've had a week of extraordinarily rich debate and discourse around this critically important issue, and you, audience, have been a very, very important part of that. And could I just thank those who have persisted night after night coming to this lecture series, and thank you in particular. You've been a backbone for us of this series, very much as Nick, our moderator, has been an absolutely essential backbone from the beginning to the end of the series. But we've come tonight at the pointy end of things. We've come to this issue of collective action, how we work together. I don't want to finish by commenting on the politics of the issue. What I'd like to do instead is talk about the quality of the people we have on the platform in front of us. It has been extraordinarily hard for many of those people to come here this evening and effectively bear themselves to 3 television studios, to the public of Australia and to you as an audience. And the reason for that is that many of them are caught in the classic political dilemma of loyalty to a party, and yet that party not entirely reflecting what your strongly held personal views might be. Before we came up on the platform, however, I observed our panellists downstairs in the green room, talking very honestly, very clearly and very constructively to each other about this issue. And I'd just like to finish this panel session by asking you to join me in wishing them well in the future as they grapple with this problem. It's not a problem caused by human evil as such. It is a problem that can be resolved by us working together. So could I just ask you to put your hands together to thank our panellists on this final evening?